Welcome back to Used to Sew, a podcast about sewing machines, sewing history, and sewing culture in the past and present. I am your producer and co-host, Aradia, daughter of your main host, T.R. Kelly. And today, we have a rewind set of episodes for you. We dropped the ball on the handoff of files before we took off for a trip this week. So I decided we would return to an old story from the early days of the podcast. Singer, the man, the myth, and the machine, as well as the invention of the sewing machine. Back in the early days of the podcast, we still hadn't worked out all the kinks from our routine and recording setups, and we made episodes a bit shorter than we tend to now. So when I was scanning for a good candidate for you all to listen to this week, it occurred to me that perhaps I could bump the runtime by showing you the progression from episode 2 to episode 7 of our first season, along with two sides of the story of how Singer made his name synonymous with sewing machine technology. Also, fun fact, we are almost to our first podcast anniversary. These episodes were published in September of 2024, which means we get to think about how to celebrate being on this train for a year. Exciting. Next week, we will be back with a scrap bag of topics and fan mail. In the meantime, please enjoy this blast from the past.
Welcome to Used to Sew. That's used to sew because we talk about things that are used to sew back when people used to sew. Yeah, it's a podcast about sewing machines, sewing culture, fabric, both back then in the hoop skirt days and now in the spandex days. We're going to talk about sewing machines, stories from the sales floor, and what can you do with your sewing machine. Can you fight fast fashion? Yes, to the bat stash.
Welcome back. Today, we being my mom, TR, and myself, Aradia.
Hello.
We are going to be talking a bit about the sewing machine character, specifically in question. That's right. It's time to hear an introductory rant about Mr. Singer.
Oh my gosh. You know, there has been actually a lot of stuff written about Singer. I'll just give you a little overview. He was a mechanic and a failed actor. Tried to start a theatrical troupe, got some money for one of his inventions, and that folded. But then he happened to be working in a mechanic shop and somebody brought in one of those new sewing machines that they were trying to invent. And he saw it and said, I can do better than that. And he actually did. But he didn't invent the thing. He just worked on a few things. It was him and 4 other guys. We'll talk about them. What Singer did was sell the thing. Sell the sewing machine. People are like, why do I need a sewing machine? Well, we also will talk about that in another episode. Why do people need sewing machines? But Singer was good at selling it. In fact, he was so good at selling it that Singer has sort of become synonymous with sewing machine all over the world. Oh yeah, my grandma had one of those, pointing to your old black sewing machine, which may or may not actually be a Singer, but she thinks it's a Singer because Grandma had a Singer. Even if it was a Viking or a Pfaff.
It's black, it's cute, it's got decals. What more do you want?
Yeah, so, it's that whole sewing machine ignorance that our culture has sort of fallen into here. The Singer company, pretty much, he was kind of a notorious character in a lot of ways. And so the company actually sort of got rid of him early on, paid him off to move away. And it was a man named Mr. Edward Clark who was actually the head of the thing. And he invented, I think, one of the most important things ever in American culture, and that is buying on time. That's right. The Singer Sewing Machine Company invented it. They called it hire purchase. And it was a little bit down and a payment every week, I think it was. And if you missed your payment, they'd repossess the machine. And the interest, I don't even think they calculated interest, but it wound up being like you'd pay 3 times more for the machine than if you could have paid cash. But machines were really expensive. It'd be like buying a car nowadays. So being able to buy it on time meant that it really got into a lot of people's houses, especially after about 1880 or so.
Right. And people needed sewing machines. This was not a manufactured requirement for people's lives, right? People needed sewing machines, kind of like cars, right? Like, you need a car. It's not really a choice unless you live in a very walkable city, which we're Americans, so that's sort of a weird concept, right?
Right.
So people needed sewing machines, but they also didn't need an endless supply of sewing machines.
Exactly. So once everybody had one, then what? Because these things, I mean, my oldest machine in my collection that sews is from 1874. It's a Singer boot machine. It could have actually sewn the cowboy boots of Wyatt Earp down in Tombstone. It's that old, and it still works. And household machines clear up until World War II were designed to be, excuse me, but bomb-proof. After World War II is when we start to see consumerism and styling creeping in over good machinery. But, Singer, being able to buy on time. And the other thing that the Singer Company did was global factories. They were the first globalists. In fact, their factory in Scotland was, at the time, the largest factory with the largest single industry workforce under one roof ever. Kilbowie, Clydebank, Scotland. If your Singer machine ends in K, that's where it was made. But Singer, they got his name, they got his showmanship, he got him on the road, and then he got out of the picture. They paid him pretty well to go away. I think he died in Europe with 3 or 4 wives and a whole bunch of kids.
Wow, that's quite the character. It's interesting that the name we associate with the sewing machine as a character, right? Because a sewing machine is a very, personable appliance.
Yeah,
it's very friendly, very easy to interact with. But he was not there for most of that. All of that is done under the name was done by other people.
He was the flash bang. He was the big thing, and if you're first, you're going to be remembered. And if you're first and big and loud and memorable, I think Singer hired the Swedish soprano, Jenny Lind, who was the singer at the time. Now remember, this is before recordings. To hear someone sing live was a big deal. Singer sponsored one of her tours of the United States. So Isaac Singer himself and the company that he founded, because he still had some say in it, but the culture was of selling. And this is a great machine, but a lot of other companies were making excellent machines as well. White, Davis, Ruby, Free Westinghouse, well, Free before Westinghouse. But it was Singer's ability to sell and to make it easy to buy. To sell the machine, emotionally, make it easy to buy through financing. So that's how Singer achieved dominance in America, United States. Well, the whole damn world, actually.
I mean, he really popularized the sewing machine from a aspirational thing that would make your life better to a keeping up with the Joneses level of must have.
That came along after the war when Singer's superiority was challenged by European machines now that Europe was back on its feet. And not to mention that, but then in the 50s, the Japanese started making excellent sewing machines, all built on Singer's original patents, of course, which is expired.
So you mentioned the globalization factor. So
yes.
This has to do with the shipping of the sewing machines from their various factories to their intended customers?
Well, this is back to the Singer being the first globalist thing, and I will have to do some more reading and check my facts, but to avoid, shipping sewing machines, my gosh, they're heavy. Because we're talking first, before electricity, they were all in big treadle stands. We're talking 300 and 400 pounds of crated up iron here. They're heavy. Shipping them costs money. Shipping them overseas, now you're going to have import duties and taxes and all that. Well, what if we just built a factory in, say, Italy, and then we can service all of our Singer stores in Europe from there? See how that works? So they built factories all over the world. Like I said, the biggest one was in Clydebank, Scotland, or Kilbowie. They also had a factory in Germany, in Poland, Brazil, Italy, Japan, and I'm sure there's a few. Taiwan in the 80s. I was selling machines made in Taiwan. But this is when Singer had its own factories there. So they weren't just buying a Taiwanese machine and putting Singer on it. It was like, that was a Singer factory, blah, blah, blah. Business stuff, meow, meow, meow. But yeah, having factories all over the world helped them achieve dominance before anybody else did. I've got some stories that I'll get to about guys that were the first people to sell sewing machines to the Inuit up in Alaska. Here's a picture of a guy with a sewing machine on a dog sled. I mean, that's dedication.
Yeah, I mean, that is definitely going the extra mile to get to your customer. Something I remember you talking to me about before we got into this was how communities would get a single sewing machine and then share it. So that was maybe also part of how people could get sold on the idea as like, well, yeah, I mean, I can have my turn, my weekly turn on the sewing machine, or I could have a sewing machine in my home every day. Like, so that's part of how it spread too,
That's
right?
what directly drove the practice of buying on credit. Because if you've got 15 people all sharing one machine, well, there's 14 more customers there that need a machine too. So you got to make it easy for them to have their own. Because if you're sewing for yourself and the old man and 4 to 10 kids and the curtains and the saddle blankets and all the textile things in your farmhouse, yeah, you need a sewing machine. You need a good sewing machine. You need it now. You don't need it on Tuesday afternoon.
Right. And you don't need it in 3 years when you've saved up or whatever.
So that is how a lot of it got started. With like a group of ladies would get together, usually through Grange, and buy one machine. But I remember even in the Little House on the Prairie books, the first machine that comes to, I don't remember which of the towns it was, but Laura describes it quite well as being very frightening and loud. And then I think in the last book, Ma gets her own sewing machine, and it was a big deal. I mean, this is like getting a car for people nowadays.
Right.
But we just don't, it's like, oh yeah, whatever.
Right. Well, and I mean, speaking of Ma, right, this is an interesting tool in the sense that it facilitates women's labor in a huge way. I mean, obviously, you know, my grandfather comes from a line of tailors who were, you know, male tailors. Like that, clearly, you know, sewing does transcend the genders, but generally sewing, particularly domestic sewing, is done by the woman of the house.
Oh, especially in the United States. Yeah.
Right. So the introduction of the sewing machine both eases women's labors, but also makes it easier for them to be more exploited because now they can produce more.
That's where you get into the sweatshops. Because who's going to work in the sweatshop? Well, who already knows how to do the sewing machine and who can be easily manipulated? Who's not going to fight back against poor working conditions? Well, that would be immigrant women, usually. Especially in the era of sweatshops in the United States as we think about them, which is the early 1900s. I think Triangle Shirtwaist Fire was 1912.
Yeah.
And most of the women that were killed in that fire were European Jews and Italians who were newly arrived in the country. So, yeah, women and the sewing machine. Yes, there are men that sew. My family was a total anomaly, but my dad's family is from Denmark, and sewing was, you know, different over there. But yeah, it went from being the empowering of a single woman or her group of friends being able to do their sewing, you know, maybe even in a group. You know, that doesn't really happen except now, quilt shop retreats and stuff. But the sewing machine was also, because it was going to ease women's work, seen as work of the devil early on. Churchmen and men in charge were very against the sewing machine because if women are not busy at their needle, they're going to get in trouble. They're going to gossip. They're going to run around. And also the motion of those treadle sewing machines could make a woman hysterical. Because your early machines were pedaled, if you don't know, by treadles, big pedal that you would put both your feet on and rock your thighs back and forth, and that could make you hysterical, and your husband would never know.
I mean, if you're sexually repressed and you never have had an orgasm in your life, maybe a treadle would be exciting.
Honey, I'm going to go do my sewing now.
I have used a treadle many times.
Oh, yeah.
We were together on the hippie commune. We had a very hippie commune phase together, and there was a treadle sewing machine, which I would like to restore. We're going to get treadles back into our lives.
I use them all the time when I'm boondocking out in the desert. But, I play the cello as well. I know how to not become hysterical.
Yeah, treadles are really fun. I am the kind of person who cannot sit still. Every recording I do, I am constantly in motion. And I love treadle. I mean, yes, it's more challenging to have to coordinate more of your limbs while you're sewing. I'm not a good drummer, so, it is hard. But, it's very rewarding to put literally your own power into the stitches.
Yeah.
It's not just that I got the fabric and I pushed a pedal to pull electricity out of the wall. I literally pushed the thread through the fabric with my own self.
And you're even growing hemp, aren't you? You need to learn how to make that into fabric. But there is so much fabric out there. You do not have to go to a fabric store. There are so many sources of fabric. What about that sheet that you don't really, your mother-in-law gave it to you, but it's a print. Your husband doesn't like it. It would make a great sundress. Come on. Or what about that sundress that you just can't stand? Cut the skirt off. That would make great kitchen curtains. Yeah. So there's fabric everywhere. Lose the thought that you got to go to the fabric store. The only thing that you have to buy new is sewing machine needles and oil.
Yeah, you can't really repurpose those. Those things don't regenerate.
Those are called
in the same
consumables.
Way. But if that's all you buy, you can have a very affordable habit.
Yeah, and, before there was petroleum, there was whale oil. We do not want to go back to that. Please do not put peanut oil, 3-in-1, canola, or organic canola rapeseed in your sewing machine. Sewing machine oil or gun oil. That's it. No WD-40. I saw you.
One last question before we close out. Can you describe for me what a sewing machine is doing with the needle and thread that is so different from hand sewing? Because you've described this to me before. I've seen the cool GIFs online that show how this works.
Oh, it's so fun.
It's so cool. Give it to the audience, please.
Okay. So the whole reason why a sewing machine took so long to invent is people couldn't get over the idea that the eye, you put the thread through the needle when you're hand sewing, right? Thread the needle. And then the needle's the pokey part and the eye is the part that you're holding and you stuff it through the fabric. Somebody, I can't remember which one of the 4 sewing machine inventors, said, hey, wait a minute. What if we put the eye at the pointy end and put the thread through there? Okay, now, watch this in your mind. The needle goes down through the fabric, and a hook catches it, pulls it around the bobbin case, because there's a big old loop, because the thing on the sewing machine that goes up and down like a chicken head? That thing went down and let a lot of thread out so that it could pull around, but then it pulls up, and it pulls that thread tight, and now you've got a lock stitch. So that's how a sewing machine forms a stitch. Most sewing machines. Your one, you're probably in your house, unless you've got a Wilcox and Gibb chain stitch, in which case I'll give you $400 for it. The needle going down, throwing a loop, passing it around a bobbin, which is another little spool of thread, and then pulling it tight, just like you would if you were sewing on a button. When you take a stitch, you pull it tight. So the sewing machine does that. But putting the point and the needle down, somebody had to think of that. Somebody had to get maybe a little whacked on opium and stare out the window and go, oh, dude, what if I turn the needle around? Yeah. So it's a simple, it's simple, and every sewing machine does that. Every lock stitch sewing machine. If the needle, even if the bobbin is one of those long pointy ones, it's still shooting through a loop that the needle put down. The bobbin's just different. It's just different, that's all. We'll talk about the different bobbins. Maybe.
It's so interesting also how you've got 2 threads.
Two
When
threads.
you do hand sewing, this isn't knitting, right? Knitting, well, not even knitting. When you do really any handcraft, you've got one fiber. With a sewing machine, you've got 2. You've got the bobbin and the top thread, and they work together, which is just very different from any kind of handcraft I can think of.
The first sewing machines were chain stitch machines, which is more like crochet. The needle still has the hole in the eye and it goes down through the fabric, but then a looper, which is a hook, catches it and pulls it up in time for the needle to catch it again. That's that thread that if you pull it, the whole seam comes apart.
Like on the bags of beans that we buy.
Yeah, on the bags,
Yeah.
cat food bags and stuff like that.
Sure.
If you tighten them off and tie them correctly, they're good. But the beautiful thing about that sort of machine is it's very simple to operate and it's really quiet. And that's the Wilcox and Gibbs chain stitch I was talking about. I do have a little Singer toy chain stitch that we'll listen to later.
All right. And with that, I think we can close the episode.
Hey,
Excellent work.
this has been Used to Sew because you used to sew and you want to again. So there are a lot of things out there that are used to sew that we're going to tell you how to use. Bye.
Welcome back to Used to Sew, a podcast about sewing machines, sewing history, and sewing culture in the past and present. I am your producer and co-host, Aradia, daughter of your main host, T.R. Kelly, who is here today to talk to you about the history of who actually invented the sewing machine. Spoilers, Isaac Singer doesn't deserve all or even most of the credit. TR is going to be reading excerpts from an essay titled Sewing Revolution, the Machine That Changed America, which is linked in full in the show notes. Because why reinvent the flywheel? And speaking of things that get reinvented, did you know that thread itself had to be reimagined once sewing machines were finally figured out? We wanted to cover this story in such depth because it touches on all three of our big pillars for making this podcast: social history, sales, and fast fashion. Half a century before cars, before sweatshops, and before the cult of domesticity had completely rewritten our collective memory of the 19th century, a network of poorly educated but mechanically gifted men had to figure out how to get a machine to replace the 2,000-year-old tradition of hand sewing. In addition to the early machines themselves being loud and prone to breakage, the relationships between these men was similarly janky. We're even going to side quest a bit into some pretty intense patent wars along the way. The number of changes to our world since then is an endless rabbit hole we will continue to explore as these episodes go by. But for today, we are going to follow the story of how the sewing machine made its first tentative test stitches into the fabric of the world we know today.
This episode of Used to Sew brought to you by your local fabric store. Look them up in your local business directory. It's not a chain. It's owned by somebody who cares about your fabric, your project, your sewing machine. Please, next time you want to buy notions, fabrics, sewing machines, classes, shop local. Your local quilt shop's there for you. Make sure you're there for them. Stay threaded. Okay. This is the sewing machine from an article intended to accompany the Windham Textile and History Museum's sewing machine collection. And this is in the state of Connecticut. This was written and researched by Jamie H. Eves, Beverly L. York, Carol Bush, and Michelle Palmer. The patenting of the sewing machine by Massachusetts native and Connecticut transplant Elias Howe in 1846 touched off a technological, industrial, and social revolution in the United States. By making possible the manufacture of inexpensive clothing, it greatly sped up the pace of American industrialization. By changing the way that clothing was manufactured, it spelled the end of cottage industry and ushered in the age of the sweatshop. By appealing to middle-class homemakers, it facilitated the cult of domesticity and provided middle-class women with the opportunity to prove that they could master complex machinery. Widely available a half-century before typewriters or automobiles, more than any other machine, the sewing machine came to symbolize American women's work in the modern machine age. People have been sewing for a long time. They began using bone needles with eyes to stitch animal skins together at least 2,000 years ago during the last ice age, and started making needles from iron about 4,000 years ago. But the sewing machine itself is a fairly recent invention, less than 200 years old. The first attempts to make sewing machines failed, largely because the inventors, all of whom were men, tried to make machines that could mimic the motions of hand sewing. Early attempts at sewing machines used only one strand of thread, and needles with eyes on the blunt ends were pushed completely through the cloth, grabbed by a clamp, and pushed back through again. Good idea, but such motions proved too complex for 18th and early 19th century technology. Barthélemy Timonier, I don't know how to say that. He's a French dude. The breakthrough came in 1830 when this French dude, Barthélemy, invented an embroidery machine that employed a modified traditional hooked embroidery needle with the hook at the point to sew a chain stitch. This machine basically failed, and a bunch of tailors smashed it all up because they were worried about the jobs. Francois, they're going to take my job. Okay, 4 years later, in 1834, other side of the big pond, Walter Hunt, an eccentric New York City mechanic, designed a crude sewing machine that employed not one but two strands of thread. An upper strand carried by a curved needle with its eye in the pointed end, and a lower strand of thread in a shuttle designed to make a chain stitch. Hunt made many crucial breakthroughs, but his sewing machine did not work well. The vertical design was clunky. There was no automatic feed. Hunt set it aside to tinker with later and never bothered to patent it. Oh, that's important. Remember that. Okay, next, Elias Howe. Like Hunt, Elias Howe was a mechanic and tinkerer with little in the way of a formal education. Howe's father was a farmer, but he had relatives in business who would later invest in Elias's invention. Traditional New England agriculture was in decline in the early 1800s, and life on a hard-scrabble farm would have been difficult. A sickly child, Elias had little energy and walked with a cane. His father apprenticed him to a textile factory, but the work was exhausting, and he gave the job up. At age 18, Howe left home and moved to Cambridge, Massachusetts, to seek his fortune and easier work. Alas, he did not find life in Cambridge any easier. He apprenticed as a carding machine mechanic with his cousin Nathaniel Banks. But the work was predictably exhausting, and so the next year, 1838, Howe moved on to apprentice to R.E. Davis, a master mechanic who specialized in making chronometers and other precision instruments. It was while working for Davis that Howe first heard about sewing machines. Boston area mechanics were all talking about how to create such a machine, and there was a general belief that whoever could build a functioning sewing machine would make his fortune. Elias Howe worked for Davis and other mechanics sporadically while also working in his spare time trying to invent a sewing machine. In 1846, Howe patented a sewing machine. It featured a lock stitch, which was an improvement over Hunt's chain stitch, also had the needle with the eye and the point, a horizontal alignment with a shuttle beneath the cloth, and an automatic feed. These were all important improvements. The problem, though, was that Howe's machine was clunky and didn't work any better than Hunt's. It jammed, the needle got caught, and it required almost constant fiddling. It was heavy. Howe sought to market it as an industrial machine and sell it to tailors and factories, which could afford to hire mechanics to constantly adjust and tinker with the machine to keep it mostly working. Most tailors, though, thought it was too expensive and not worth the trouble. They could hire hand sewers much cheaper. Without a ready market for his finicky sewing machine, Elias Howe and his older brother Amasa Howe went to England to seek financing. Neither succeeded. Elias returned to the United States in 1849, settling in Connecticut. His wife, who had worked to support him, died the next year. Things were dire. Thus, as of 1850, Howe had a patent for a sewing machine that did not really work and which nobody wanted. He had no money, and he was still sickly. Even worse, other mechanics were starting to make sewing machines, some of which worked better than his. Isaac Singer. One of those mechanics was Isaac Singer, who was, like Hunt and Howe, a mechanic, although with even less training. He was also an actor, but not a good one. Singer was also aggressive, loudmouthed, a bully, a serial liar, and completely self-absorbed. In short, he was a sociopath. During his lifetime, Singer had several wives and mistresses. Most of his marriages were illegal, as he neglected to get divorces from his earlier wives. He fathered at least 24 children. Singer left home early. Finding his way to Ohio, he worked for a while with a company that was building a canal, and he invented and patented a rock drill and sold the rights to his employer for $2,000, about $50,000 in today's money. He then blew this windfall, creating an acting troupe with himself as the lead actor. While doing this, he abandoned his first wife and took up with his second. The acting troupe failed. At age 38, Singer moved in with his second wife and their 8 children to New York, where he rented a shop and set to work trying to invent a woodblock cutting machine for use in typesetting. When the boiler blew up and demolished the building, he slipped out of town and went to Boston to try his luck there. It was in Boston that Singer heard about attempts to invent a sewing machine. Singer repeatedly formed relationships with both men and women whom he could bully. In Boston, he teamed up with a well-meaning but weak-willed mechanic, Orson Phelps, who owned his own machine shop. He bullied Phelps into doing much of the work. Singer's sewing machine was only a little bit better than Howe's. Like Howe, he conceived of it as an industrial machine. Singer was good at designing big, powerful machines, but not so much at making delicate precision instruments. The machine he patented in 1851 was heavy, clumsy, and incapable of doing delicate work, but it did include some crucial improvements over Howe's design. Singer made the shuttle move in a straight line rather than a circle, and his needles were straight, not curved. Lacking financing, Singer teamed up with banker Edward Clark, who turned out to be the one person that Singer was never able to bully. Together, Singer and Clark began manufacturing sewing machines for tailors in a factory in New York. The market turned out to be limited, however. As Howe had already discovered, tailors were not interested in big, noisy, clunky machines that needed constant tinkering. It was cheaper for them to hire hand sewers. Singer and Clark only sold a few machines. By 1850, several mechanics, Hunt, Howe, Singer, and a few others, had developed sewing machines, but none of them worked well. Enter Allen Wilson. Like Hunt, Howe, and Singer, Wilson was another mechanic with little formal education, and like the others, he was also eccentric. In Wilson's case, the oddity was that he was intensely shy, introverted, and lacking in self-esteem. He was also, as it turned out, quite brilliant. Moving to Massachusetts, Wilson took a job as a mechanic. In his spare time, he began working on trying to invent a sewing machine, although he knew nothing about Hunt, Howe, or Singer. He found a local investor who soon gave up on him. At this point, Wilson moved to Connecticut. Here he found luck. A brand new magazine, the New York City-based Scientific American, helped him apply for a patent, something they did for other inventors as well, which he received in 1850. But alas, Wilson still needed money to begin manufacturing. He ended up being bilked by 2 New York City shysters who cheated him and stole his patent. Desperate for work and with a family to support, Wilson gave up trying to invent a sewing machine and took a job as a mechanic with a Connecticut-based manufacturer, Nathaniel Wheeler, who owned a machine shop in Watertown, Connecticut. Wheeler, too, was unusual. He was both impeccably honest and a shrewd businessman. When Wheeler discovered who his new employee was, he talked Wilson into going back to tinkering with sewing machines. Wilson worked out the last remaining practical problems, patented his improvements, and built something that Hunt, Howe, and Singer had not, a sewing machine that actually worked. The 2 men founded Wheeler and Wilson, a partnership, in 1852 in Watertown, Connecticut. Wheeler supplied the capital, and Wilson supplied the engineering know-how and his patents for the rotary hook and the 4-motion feed. By the 1870s, it was one of the world's largest manufacturers of sewing machines, second only to Singer. The Singer Company bought out Wheeler and Wilson in 1908, long after all the original principals had passed away. The lawsuit. So by the mid-1850s, several different manufacturers were, with varying amounts of success, making and selling sewing machines. Most of them had patents of some sort. Howe was almost completely a failure at actually making and selling sewing machines, but he had the oldest and best patent. So with his brother Amas's help, in 1849 he sued the other companies for patent infringement. His case looked cut and dried. Then Singer's partner, Edward Clark, found out about Hunt's prior non-patented invention. Seeking out Hunt, Clark persuaded Hunt to sue Howe, claiming that Howe had stolen the idea from him. In the end, however, Howe won on a 19th century technicality. As a free thinker, Hunt could not in good faith take the required religious oath that his testimony was the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help him God. And so his case was thrown out, and Howe won. Thus, in 1854, Howe had won. But really all he had won was the right to order the other manufacturers to cease and desist. He still couldn't make a sewing machine that actually worked. So in 1856, Orlando Potter, the president of the Grover and Baker Company, called a meeting in New York of all the main sewing machine manufacturers and would-be manufacturers. Baker suggested forming a patent pool, where all of them, including Howe, would pool their various patents. In addition, Howe would be paid a generous annual stipend. All the companies in the pool would be able to manufacture sewing machines. All would have access to Howe's, Singer's, and Wilson's patents, the latter of which actually allowed sewing machines to function and be marketable. Until Elias Howe's original patent for the sewing machine expired in 1877, production and sales were dominated by the companies that had joined with Howe in 1856 to form the sewing machine combination. The sewing machine combination was the first of the massive trusts that dominated American and global industry in the Gilded Age. Howe, Singer, Wheeler and Wilson, and Grover and Baker were the sewing machine combination. Other manufacturers had to pay license fees. At $15 per machine, the license fees were steep enough to discourage competition. Still, 36 different companies produced sewing machines in those years, and sales increased briskly each decade. In 1877, Howe's original patent expired, as did the combine. So what happened to Elias Howe? He got rich off royalties. He took advantage of the patent pool to form two companies in New York and Bridgeport that manufactured functioning, serviceable home sewing machines. What happened to Singer? Singer's partner, Edward Clark, quickly bought him out. Singer was now very rich, as he continued to collect royalties from his company. Singer retired to a life of luxury and notoriety. When his wife caught him with one of his many mistresses, Singer fled to England to avoid the repercussions, where he soon took up with another mistress. Singer died in England in 1875, worth $13 million, but was generally despised by all who knew him. Almost all of the major business innovations that would eventually make the Singer Company the #1 manufacturer of home sewing machines were Edward Clark's ideas, not Isaac Singer. Under Edward Clark, the Singer Company became the world's largest sewing machine manufacturer, even though most of the important technological advances had been made by Wheeler and Wilson, who Singer bought. Why? Why was Singer the world's largest sewing machine manufacturer? There are several reasons. In 1856, the company began making home sewing machines. At $100 a machine, $2,700 in today's money, these were expensive. So Clark introduced mass production and interchangeable parts, lowering the cost 50%. Eventually, the company was able to sell a new home sewing machine for $10, $273 in today's money. The company also introduced installment plans, marketed aggressively overseas, and marketed directly to women consumers. It also pioneered electric machines and cabinets that doubled as attractive furniture. The Willimantic Linen Company and the sewing machine. The invention and perfection of the sewing machine in the 1840s and 50s vastly increased the market for smooth, sturdy, and uniform factory-made thread. Hand-spun thread was too weak and irregular for the new machines. In 1864, in Willimantic, Connecticut, the Willimantic Linen Company erected a massive new mill expressly for manufacturing sewing machine thread. According to an 1880 article about the Willimantic Linen Company in Scribner's Monthly, while hand sewing is a matter of convenience and ease, call for an even thread, the introduction of very widespread use of the sewing machine has called for some of the same qualities as even more essential. Sewing machines now take 90% of the thread that is made, and in order to do their own work, these automatic seamstresses must be satisfied or they will summarily strike, meaning jam up. It was just as sewing machines began to come into use that the manufacture of Willimantic thread on an extensive scale began. And the whole bent of the business there has been to supply a proper thread for machine use, since any thread that suits a machine suits anything. The best incidental evidence of the success of the Willimantic efforts is found in the fact that at the 1876 Centennial Exposition at Philadelphia, where all of the sewing machines of the world came into competition on their own merits, all but two of them used the Willimantic thread. To make sure that its product was strong enough, the Willimantic Linen Company twisted 6 strands of spun thread together into a single strand of 6-cord sewing machine thread. The company wound the thread onto both wooden spools and paper bobbins, the latter of which were sold primarily to sweatshops for use in industrial-sized sewing machines. The company advertised its thread as the best thread for sewing machines. By the 1890s, thanks to the heavy demand for sewing machine thread, the Willimantic Linen Company was a financial success and one of the largest thread mills in the world. The rise of the middle class and the cult of domesticity. The 19th century in America saw the emergence of the modern middle class. With it came dramatic changes in family life. Typically, middle-class families owned their own homes, lived in the new suburbs, and could get by with only one breadwinner, usually the husband, father. Unlike working-class and agricultural families where the wife, mother, almost always contributed to the family economy by earning wages or laboring on the farm, in middle-class families, the wife mother was usually also a full-time homemaker, primarily responsible for preparing meals, making and mending clothes, cleaning the home, and caring for the children. Despite the fact that most middle-class American families actually remained quite patriarchal during the 1900s, 19th century Americans created the fiction of the so-called cult of domesticity, the myth that it was women, not their husbands, who actually controlled the homes. When middle-class women acquired and furnished their sewing rooms, complete with sewing machines, society generally regarded it as proof that the cult of domesticity actually existed, and that these sewing rooms were manifestation of women's increasing power within the home. However, the new mythology ignored the fact that the decision to buy a new sewing machine was usually made by the husband, who controlled the family bank accounts.
And there you have it. TR reading selected sections of the essay Sewing Revolution from the Windham Textile and History Museum, which detailed the complicated, confusing, and chaotic birth of the sewing machine we are all familiar with today. I had a great time recording and editing this episode. In addition to the essay just being well written, I was fascinated to hear about all the men that put together the pieces of what would become such an iconic appliance in the home. Sickly, awkward, struggling with life and each other, they somehow created a machine that would remake the world. I also missed some of the details during the recording itself because I was busy checking levels or the time elapsed or something else producery. So there were definitely some surprises to me during editing. The patent war stuff especially went over my head until the edit. But wow, what a weird part of inventing stuff. And the patent pool being part of the beginning of the American Gilded Age? Fascinating. Fascinating history that I am very interested to learn more about as we continue in this podcast. We will almost certainly return to this specific essay for more information in the future because there's a lot we didn't have time to get into in this episode. If you like this kind of episode where we read sections of a more in-depth work, please be sure to let us know on social media or by email or on Patreon. As a reminder, we are unofficially sponsored by Stagecoach Road Vintage Sewing Machine, who do repairs and restorations. You can follow us on Facebook and Instagram, and you can support us by sharing the podcast with your friends, and also with money, at patreon.com/used2sew. Thank you for listening to us here at Used to Sew. We always welcome your additions, corrections, and feedback in general. Please reach out to us via email at used2sew@gmail.com. Used to Sew is a production of Fox and Raven Media. For more podcasts from Fox and Raven Media, visit our website at foxandravenmedia.com.